My summer break was supposed to be just like any other. But when I got a call from my dad asking me to come home, something about his voice felt different. He sounded worried, and that wasn't like him. When I arrived, the house felt strangely quiet. My dad told me he'd been called on an urgent business trip that could last a few weeks. He asked if I'd help his new wife, Laura, keep things running smoothly at home. Dad was always busy, rarely having time for either of us. But I could tell Laura felt uneasy in his absence. She'd always been kind to me, and though we weren't particularly close, there was something new in her gaze this time, a mix of weariness and loneliness. Her smile was warm as usual, but her eyes seemed to hold something else. A few days went by quickly. I helped out around the house, trying to make things easier for her, but Laura only seemed more tense. One evening, I found her sitting on the couch, staring off into space. Her shoulders were hunched, and I could see she was deep in thought. "Laura, are you okay?" I asked, sitting down beside her. She shook her head, then sighed, as if debating whether to share her thoughts. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you know what it's like to feel alone in your own home?" she asked softly. "I miss your father. The way he used to be." I nodded, sensing she felt isolated. Dad was always working, and it hit me that maybe she was going through more than I'd realized. "Maybe you just need a break," I offered, hoping to lift her spirits. "Something relaxing." She gave me a grateful smile, but there was something in her gaze, a thoughtful look that seemed to linger. The next day after dinner, Laura approached me with a soft smile and asked, "Do you really think I should try to relax more?" Her question caught me off guard, but I nodded. "Of course. Sometimes all it takes is just a little time for yourself." She paused thoughtfully before giving me a warm look. "Maybe you could help me. I've heard a massage can do wonders for tension." I felt a flicker of uncertainty, but didn't want to turn her down. "Yeah, sure, I could do that," I replied, trying to stay calm. Laura led me into the living room, dimming the lights to create a comfortable atmosphere. She sat at the edge of the couch, her back facing me, and I began gently massaging her shoulders, feeling the tension slowly melting away under my hands. As my hands moved across her shoulders, I could feel each tense muscle relaxing, and I saw how Laura was gradually letting her guard down. Her breathing became more even, her shoulders dropped slightly, and in the quiet of the room, I could feel a certain closeness that hadn't been there before. "This feels nice," she whispered softly, her voice carrying a hint of something more. Her tone sounded different, like she was discovering something new in our shared silence. With every gentle motion, my hands drifted lower along her back, and the unspoken feeling between us seemed to grow. Her hand lightly touched mine for just a second, our eyes meeting briefly. I saw something in her gaze that was difficult to define. It was more than gratitude. The air around us grew thick with an unspoken tension. Laura turned to look at me, and her expression held a mixture of surprise and perhaps a quiet courage. For a moment, we remained in that close proximity, and I felt my heart racing. "Thank you," she said quietly, her gaze not wavering. Her hand stayed on mine a second longer before she slowly let go, leaving us both with feelings that were hard to explain. That brief closeness left me with questions I couldn't ignore. What was that? Was I even supposed to feel such an attachment to her? Suddenly, our relationship seemed far more complicated, and I didn't know how to proceed. After that moment, we both lingered in the room, and almost unintentionally, she brought up the massage again, letting me feel that maybe she welcomed this kind of support. Days slipped into each other, and Laura and I found ourselves spending more time together than I'd expected. We didn't speak much of that quiet moment during the massage, but the memory lingered in the spaces between us. The way she looked at me afterward had left me both curious and conflicted. One evening, after a long day of errands and helping out around the house, I found her sitting on the back porch, her gaze lost in the distance. The soft glow of the setting sun cast a warm light around her, highlighting the tiredness on her face. "You look like you could use a break," I said, joining her on the steps. She looked at me, smiling faintly. I think I forgot what a real break feels like. There was a hint of something vulnerable in her tone, and I felt an unexpected urge to comfort her. "It must be tough, carrying everything on your own," I said, trying to put myself in her shoes. She nodded, her gaze turning thoughtful. It's just sometimes I feel like I'm taking on too much. And your dad, well, he's been so busy. Her words hung in the air, laced with a kind of quiet sadness. I didn't know what to say, so I reached out, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. It was a small gesture, but her hand found mine, and for a moment, neither of us moved. A few nights later, Laura brought up the idea of a massage again. She'd had a stressful day managing some financial issues, and I could tell she was wound up. So, without overthinking it, I agreed. We returned to the dimly lit living room, and she settled on the couch, her back to me. I began massaging her shoulders, this time allowing my hands to work more confidently, trying to ease away the tension she carried. The room was silent, save for the sound of our breathing. My hands moved across her shoulders, then lower along her back, each motion drawing us closer in a way I hadn't anticipated. Her breathing grew steady, and I could feel her relaxing under my touch. After a while, she let out a soft sigh. "You have a natural gift for this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm glad it's helping," I replied, my own voice quieter than I intended. Her hand reached back and brushed against mine, a simple movement that sent a jolt through me. She didn't pull away, and neither did I. Instead, I let my hand rest there, both of us suspended in that quiet, shared moment. As the massage continued, I noticed how Laura's posture softened, her tension melting under my hands. She tilted her head slightly, leaning into my touch as though silently inviting me to stay. I couldn't ignore the pull between us, the feeling that something had shifted, deepening the bond we shared. She turned slightly, looking over her shoulder at me, her expression unreadable. Our eyes met, and for a moment, it felt as if the room grew smaller, like we were the only two people in the world. Without breaking eye contact, she gave a faint smile, her gaze filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. Her words were simple, but the way she looked at me spoke volumes. I could sense that she felt it too, the connection, the unspoken understanding. It was a moment suspended in time, and for the first time, I wondered if I'd ever be able to forget it. The following morning, I couldn't shake the memory of the previous night. Every detail replayed in my mind. The way her shoulders relaxed, the softness in her voice, the way she looked at me, as if sharing a secret. It left me with questions, ones I wasn't sure I wanted answers to. Laura seemed different too. She moved around the house with a calmness I hadn't seen in her before, yet there was a quiet tension in her eyes whenever we crossed paths. I caught her looking at me a few times, her gaze lingering just a second too long, and each time, it left me feeling both thrilled and unsettled. We went through our daily routines with an unspoken understanding, each of us careful not to break the delicate balance that had formed. But the memory of that night remained between us, a reminder of something that was slowly changing. Later that evening, as we sat together for dinner, the silence between us was comfortable, yet charged. We talked about small things, the errands we'd run, plans for the weekend, even the weather, but underneath our words was a tension that neither of us wanted to address. At one point, she looked at me, her gaze soft. "I just wanted to say thank you again," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "For being here, for everything." I nodded, feeling a warmth spread through me. "You don't have to thank me," I replied. "I'm just glad I could help." Our eyes met across the table, and for a moment, it felt as if the rest of the world had faded away. There was something in her gaze, a depth of emotion that left me breathless. I wanted to say something to acknowledge the bond we shared, but the words felt too heavy. Instead, we sat in silence, each of us holding onto the memory of that connection, uncertain of where it would lead. As days passed, it became harder to ignore the pull between us. We went about our daily routines as though nothing had changed, but I could sense the growing tension in every glance, every accidental touch. Each moment we spent together seemed to deepen the connection, yet neither of us dared to acknowledge it. One evening, after another long day of errands and responsibilities, I found Laura sitting on the back porch, wrapped in a blanket as she looked out into the darkening sky. She didn't notice me at first, so I took a quiet moment to observe her. Her shoulders looked tense, and I could see the weight of everything she was carrying. Without a word, I approached and sat beside her. She glanced over, her face softening when she saw me, a tired smile touching her lips. "It's been a long day, hasn't it?" she murmured, her voice filled with a quiet exhaustion. I nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "It has," I agreed, reaching out instinctively to place a hand on her shoulder. "But you're handling everything so well." She gave a soft laugh, but it was tinged with sadness. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm even handling it at all," she replied, her gaze distant. "It just feels overwhelming." Without thinking, I squeezed her shoulder gently, trying to offer what comfort I could. Her hand found mine, resting there for a second, and I felt the warmth of her touch linger, as if she were holding onto it just a little too long. A few nights later, we found ourselves in the living room again. The routine had become familiar now. She would ask for a massage, and I'd do my best to ease her tension. But tonight felt different. There was something in her expression, a quiet vulnerability that made my chest tighten. I began massaging her shoulders, my hands moving slowly as I tried to work out the knots of stress. Her breathing slowed, and I could feel her gradually relaxing under my touch. With each passing moment, the silence between us grew heavier, filled with an unspoken understanding. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Her words struck something within me, and I felt a surge of emotion that I couldn't explain. "You don't have to thank me," I replied softly. "I'm just glad I could be here for you." Her hand reached back, gently brushing against mine, and I felt my heart race. She didn't pull away, and neither did I. Instead, our fingers lingered together, and in that brief moment, it felt as if we'd crossed an invisible line. The next morning, I couldn't shake the memory of the previous night. Her touch, the quiet connection between us, lingered in my thoughts, and I found myself constantly replaying the details in my mind. There was something there, something more than just gratitude, and it left me feeling both exhilarated and confused. Laura seemed different too. Her gaze would linger a moment longer when we crossed paths, and I noticed the faintest hint of a smile whenever we were alone together. It was as if we were both aware of the bond that had formed between us, yet neither of us dared to name it. One evening, after we'd finished dinner, she looked at me with a softness in her eyes that took me by surprise. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice barely audible. "You've been my rock through all of this." There was something in her gaze, a depth of emotion that left me breathless. I wanted to say something, to acknowledge the connection we shared, but the words felt too heavy. Instead, I reached out, placing my hand over hers in a silent gesture of support. She held my hand, her fingers warm against mine, and for a moment, it felt as if we were the only two people in the world. It was a moment suspended in time, a connection that went beyond words. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about her. The way her hand had felt in mine, the softness in her eyes, the quiet vulnerability she'd shared. There was a part of me that wanted to cross that final boundary, to tell her everything I felt, but another part held me back, unsure of where it would lead. The next day, we went about our routine in silence, each of us carrying the weight of our unspoken emotions. But as the day wore on, I felt the tension between us growing, an undeniable pull that neither of us could ignore. That evening, after a quiet dinner, Laura suggested we sit on the porch. The night was calm, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves around us as we sat side by side, each lost in our own thoughts. After a long silence, she finally spoke. "Do you ever wonder how things might have been different?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Her words took me by surprise, and I turned to look at her, my heart racing. "Different how?" She hesitated, glancing down before looking back at me, her gaze filled with a quiet sadness. "If things had been simpler, if we'd met under different circumstances." Her words hung in the air, and I felt a surge of emotion, a quiet thrill that left me breathless. I wanted to reach out, to hold her hand, to tell her that I felt the same way, but the weight of our connection, the complexity of our situation, held me back. Instead, I looked at her, letting the silence speak for me. She seemed to understand, her eyes softening as she reached out, her hand resting on mine. For a moment, it felt as if the world had faded away, leaving only the two of us, caught in a quiet connection that went beyond words. And as we sat there, the weight of our bond settled over us, a reminder of everything we'd shared and everything we couldn't have. The days that followed our quiet confession on the porch were filled with an intense silence. Neither of us dared to speak of it, but the weight of what had happened lingered in every look, every accidental touch. It was as if an invisible thread connected us, drawing us closer with each passing moment, yet holding us back with the knowledge of what lay beyond that line. One evening, as we finished dinner, Laura looked more exhausted than ever. Her shoulders slumped, and there was a weariness in her eyes that made my heart ache. I wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but I wasn't sure where the line was anymore. "You should take a break," I suggested softly, hoping to offer some relief. She looked at me, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Maybe you're right," she murmured. I don't know if I can keep doing this on my own." There was a vulnerability in her voice that pulled me in, and before I could stop myself, I offered, "I can help in whatever way you need." Her gaze softened, and for a moment, she looked at me with a gratitude that was laced with something deeper. "Thank you," she whispered. "I can't tell you how much it means to me." Later that night, as I was preparing to head to bed, I heard a soft knock on my door. Surprised, I opened it to find Laura standing there, her expression uncertain. "I know it's late," she began hesitantly, "but would you mind spending a little more time with me? Just talking?" Her request was unexpected, but I could see the loneliness in her eyes. Without a word, I nodded, following her back to the living room. She settled onto the couch, and I sat beside her, feeling the quiet intensity of the moment. For a while, we sat in comfortable silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you ever feel like there's something missing? Even when you have everything you thought you wanted?" Her question struck a chord, and I nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think everyone feels that way sometimes." She looked at me, her gaze searching. "It's strange, isn't it? How you can be surrounded by people and still feel alone." Her words hung in the air, filled with an unspoken emotion that left my chest feeling tight. I wanted to reach out, to offer her the comfort she needed, but I wasn't sure if it was right. The silence stretched between us, and then, almost without thinking, she leaned into me, resting her head on my shoulder. My heart pounded, but I didn't pull away. Instead, I wrapped an arm around her, letting her find solace in the quiet comfort of our shared warmth. We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, neither of us saying a word. Her breathing slowed, and I felt her relax, as though she'd finally let go of the weight she'd been carrying. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible. I didn't realize how much I needed this. I swallowed, feeling the intensity of the moment. Neither did I. Her hand found mine, her fingers entwining with mine, and for a moment, it felt as if the rest of the world had disappeared, leaving only us. I could feel her warmth, the softness of her touch, and it left me feeling both exhilarated and terrified. As the night wore on, I found myself speaking words I hadn't planned to say. "Laura," I began, my voice barely steady. I don't know how to explain this, but there's something here, something I can't ignore." She looked at me, her gaze filled with a mixture of understanding and sadness. "I feel it too," she whispered. "But what does it mean?" Her question hung in the air, a reminder of everything we couldn't have. I wanted to tell her that it didn't matter, that the connection between us was enough. But I knew that wasn't true. Instead, I held her hand, letting the silence speak for us. We both knew that this was something neither of us had planned, something that couldn't be explained. And yet, here we were, caught in a bond that defied all reason. As the first light of dawn crept through the window, we both knew that our time together was coming to an end. The intensity of the night had left us with a quiet understanding, a realization that our connection was something rare, something that couldn't be ignored. She looked at me, Her eyes filled with a sadness that echoed in my own heart. Maybe it's best if we both try to move on," she whispered, her voice trembling. Her words struck a chord, and I felt a pang of loss that I couldn't explain. I wanted to protest, to tell her that we didn't have to give this up, but I knew she was right. Our bond, however strong, was built on fragile ground, and to pursue it would only lead to more pain. I nodded, my voice thick with emotion. "Maybe you're right." We sat in silence, each of us holding onto the memory of our time together, a bond that had changed us both. And as the morning light grew brighter, I realized that this was our goodbye, a farewell to the connection we'd shared, a reminder of a summer we would never forget. In the days that followed, we both tried to return to normal. Our interactions became polite, careful, each of us treading lightly as though afraid of reigniting the spark we'd shared. I spent more time out of the house, finding excuses to be away, while she busied herself with tasks that kept her mind occupied. The silence between us grew heavier, filled with the weight of everything we'd left unsaid. But the memory of that night remained, a quiet presence that haunted each interaction, each fleeting glance. And though we both knew that our connection was something that couldn't continue, the memory of it stayed with us, a bittersweet reminder of what had been and what could never be. In the weeks that followed, life gradually returned to normal, or at least as close to normal as it could be. Laura and I fell back into our routines, each of us carrying on as if nothing had changed. Yet, beneath the surface, I knew that neither of us could forget what had happened between us, nor could we ignore how it had affected us. We were careful around each other now, moving through the house with a kind of unspoken agreement. Every interaction was polite, every glance cautious, as if we both feared reigniting the spark that had once bound us so tightly. But even as we tried to move forward, the memory of our connection lingered, a silent reminder of everything we'd shared. It was as if that summer had left an invisible mark on us, something that would always be there, just beneath the surface. Over time, I started spending more days away from home. I threw myself into work, meeting friends, anything to put distance between myself and the feelings I couldn't fully let go of. Laura did the same, pouring herself into tasks and projects around the house. It was as if we both understood that space was the only way to move forward, the only way to protect what was left of our family. On the rare occasions when we did cross paths, there was a quiet tension in the air, a shared understanding that neither of us would address. Our conversations were brief, our interactions careful, and though we tried to appear normal, we both knew that things would never be the same. One evening, as I was leaving for a few days to visit some friends, Laura met me at the door. She looked at me with a soft, sad smile, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper. "Take care of yourself," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, feeling a surge of emotion that I struggled to suppress. "You too, Laura?" For a moment, we stood in silence, each of us holding onto the memory of what we'd shared, a bond that had changed us both. And as I walked out the door, I knew that this was a final goodbye to that part of our lives, a farewell to the connection that had once bound us. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself reflecting on that summer more often than I'd expected. The memory of our time together lingered, a quiet presence that haunted my thoughts, a reminder of a bond that went beyond words. There were moments when I'd catch myself thinking of her, the softness in her eyes, the way her hand had felt in mine, the quiet vulnerability she'd shared. It was a bittersweet memory, a reminder of a time when we'd found solace in each other, even if it was only temporary. I wondered if she thought of me too, if she felt the same quiet longing that had become a part of me. But I knew that our lives had moved on, that we were each finding our own way forward, carrying the memory of that connection as a part of who we'd become. One afternoon, months later, I ran into her at a local cafe. She was sitting by the window, lost in thought, and when she looked up and saw me, her eyes widened in surprise. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the memory of that summer hanging between us. "Hi," I said, my voice soft. "Hi," she replied, her gaze filled with a quiet warmth. We sat together, sharing a cup of coffee, our conversation light and easy. We talked about our lives, our plans, everything that had happened since we'd last seen each other. It felt natural, comfortable, as if we'd both come to terms with what we'd shared and were ready to let it rest. As we said goodbye, she looked at me, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with a quiet sincerity. "For everything?" I nodded, feeling a warmth spread through me. "Thank you too, Laura." And as I watched her walk away, I knew that this was the closure we both needed, a quiet end to a chapter that would always be a part of us. Life moved on, but the memory of that summer remained, a bittersweet reminder of a bond that had changed us both. I knew that I'd never forget Laura, that she would always be a part of my story, just as I was a part of hers. Whenever I thought of her, I felt a mixture of sadness and gratitude, a sense of loss for what we couldn't have, but also a deep appreciation for the support we'd offered each other in our darkest moments. And though we'd chosen to let go of what had been, the memory of that connection stayed with me, a quiet reminder of everything we'd left unsaid. It was a memory that would stay with me, a part of who I'd become, a reminder of a summer when everything had changed.